Thank you all. Okay, so I want to start this by just kind of reflecting something, looking back in time a little bit. So there's this wonderful quote from Aaron Swartz, who did so much for like the Creative Commons and the open web. He wrote on his blog back in 2002, he wrote this. He wrote, I care about not having to maintain cranky AOL server, Postgres and Oracle installs. Oh, yeah, that sounds like things I would like to avoid as well. And he said this in a blog post that he wrote on his own blog that was entitled Bake, Don't Fry. And what he was talking about there is this notion of instead of frying content out on demand when people came to your site and requested it, you should bake it ahead of time, kind of batch it all up and do it ahead of time. Really what he was talking about there, he was talking about pre-rendering and doing that rather than rendering on demand. And when we're talking about rendering, what we're really saying is we're talking about generating markup. I'm ever so self-conscious about talking about server render or pre-rendering. I think I used the expression server render once, and someone tapped me on the shoulder and said, you mean a web server emitting HTML, right? But yeah, that's what I meant. But all of this, was what he was kind of talking about this, and he was really talking about simplifying the stack. I love the notion of simplifying the stack because development projects are complicated enough. Let me see if there are any people in the room who kind of recognize this notion of the perfect project and the perfect project timeline that you might have worked on. We'll draw a line from start to finish, and the project starts at the very beginning when we have a brief. We receive a brief, and it ends, obviously, when we receive the awards. It went great. Sadly, this is a nonsense because there is no perfect project timeline. Let's unpack it a tiny bit. Well, first of all, we don't deserve the awards because we haven't done any work yet. So at some point, we'll start doing the work. Before we can receive any awards, we need to launch something. So towards the end of the project, there'll be an actual launch. Before we even get started, we should probably kind of define a scope for the project. Yes, we have the brief, but what is done going to look like? We'll define that. And then before we can launch it, we'll probably need some kind of final sign-off from the client to say, yes, you built what was written about in the scope. That's great. And to be able to give us that nod, they'll probably have some kind of big client review, which is our kind of big day. So the time is already getting compacted. We have to do a lot in a lot less time than we're expected. But we kind of get started with our work, and we're building things, and we're getting them out into the world, and we're reviewing them. And after we've been working a while and starting getting closer to our client review date, that's when we rescope, because now the client's seen how things are going, and we've gone, we're going to build a different thing instead, after all. That's fine, it happens. So then we kind of keep on working a little bit more frantically now, doing faster and faster work. Our processes are hopefully holding up. We get to our client review date, and we're happy, except we're not happy. We've got other things to do, it turns out, after the review. This is starting to get to be a real scramble now. Our processes are starting to hold up. Hopefully our deployment is all working okay. And then this happens. I don't know what that is. I don't know why it's over there. It happens to us all at the best of times, usually around crunch time. That's fine, because we know what the problem is. We'll fix it. The next deploy will be perfect. It's not perfect. It's now also in the wrong place, and for some reason, it's a piece of fruit. We don't know why that is. Deployments are sometimes unexpected. But then we get back on track. We do a bit more work. We get to our final sign-off date. We're delighted. We get final sign-off, except it's not final sign-off. It's final sign-off, in quotes, because there's just a few more comments. So we'll do a little bit more work. Then we'll get to launch. And then we'll do a few more bits of work, which are the fixes, and then it's a shit show, is what I'm saying. It's complex enough. Launch day can look a bit like this. I think this is stolen wholesale from MailChimp. This is the button you press when you mail out to millions of people. And this is what deploying a site and what a launch can look like. There's unpredictable pieces. We never know what they're going to look like. It's a bit of a nightmare when you're working in this kind of environment. So I love this notion of simplifying the stack. And this is kind of what we're talking about with JAMstack. I'm going to get into this in more detail after I've just enjoyed this therapy for a second. JAMstack stands for JavaScript APIs and Markup. That's what the jam in that is. But what does that even mean? Well, I'm going to get to that in just a second. My name's Phil Hawksworth. You've heard from me already before. I do indeed work in the developer experience team at Netlify. If you've got questions and you can't grab me, please grab me later on. But if you'd like to ask questions, you can also do so on Twitter. I'm very happy to answer questions there. But I'll try and get into some information in this session that will hopefully help, because I want to get into like a bit more of a definition and more of a description, really, of what JAMstack is. I want to talk about the impact and the implications of adopting this kind of stack. Along the way, I'll try and describe a couple of tools and services that can potentially help. And then also I'll try and reveal, some resources and some good first steps to try this if you should like. But just kind of returning to this notion of simplifying the stack. Well, already we're kind of dealing with slightly loaded terms. There are stacks already. There are lots of stacks around. Does the world really need another one? We've got the mean stamp, the lamp stack, the MAMP stack, the Weezer stack, the Ruby on Rails. That doesn't work in the same way. It's not as gratifying. There's probably many more besides. So does the world need another one? Why do we need this JAMstack? Well, let me try and be a touch more descriptive about JAMstack. So this might be a bit difficult to read at the back. I'll read it out, so apologies if it's a bit small. So JAMstack is a modern architecture to create fast and secure sites and dynamic apps with JavaScript, APIs, and pre-rendered markup served without web servers. And it's this kind of thing at the end that sounds a little bit unusual. I love getting web servers out of the equation because fewer bits of infrastructure make me happy. So let's try and explain that a little bit more by looking at a traditional stack versus the JAMstack. And let's look at this kind of example of a traditional serving of a request. So in this scenario, we've got our web browser and we want to make a request for a view, some kind of a page. So we'll send off our HTTP request. And perhaps it's hitting a CDN, but more likely it's hitting some infrastructure that we manage somewhere that might be a load balancer. And that load balancer will determine, okay, which of our websites is going to service this request. We might have many that we're kind of spreading the load across. And those web servers might need to compile a view. They might need to apply templates and content and data. Maybe that data is held in a database, so we'll make a request off to a database. We'll get that data back, compile it into a view, pass it back through the load balancer. Perhaps on the way through a CDN, we'll cache some items for future, and then ultimately we'll return something back into the browser and into the eyeballs of our user. So there's a lot of steps here, and of course this isn't every web architecture, but it's a fairly typical web architecture for something that's working at some kind of a scale, and there's a bunch of moving parts there. So if we compare that traditional kind of stack to the JAMstack, this is how the JAMstack would work in comparison. So similar scenario, making a request from a web browser. That request hits a CDN or a static server, which has the view compiled and pre-rendered, and it returns it to the browser. So yes, it's shorter. I like that very much. I used to occasionally refer to this as the short stack because there are fewer pieces to consider. But this is the kind of comparison. We're going to come back to this diagram a bunch of times because the JAMstack, I think, really means it's a site that's capable of being served from either a static server or a CDN directly. It doesn't need machinery behind the scenes to crank on request time to service these requests. It offers an opportunity to reduce complexity. Fewer boxes there on that diagram at request time, and I think that's key. It kind of enjoys the benefits of serving static assets, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of those benefits as we go along. Now, you might be looking at that last diagram and hearing me say a few of these words and think, okay, Phil, but isn't this just a fancy new name for static sites? That's a fair question. And in many ways, yeah, it is. It's a fancy new name for static sites, but static sites are so different to what we might have expected before because the ecosystem has changed, the tooling and the technologies have changed so much that actually it's gone way beyond that now. But I use this word static, and I do so with kind of caution because when I say the word static, you don't think of something cool necessarily. You might think of something that's a little bit undesirable. And in fact, if we look up the dictionary definition of static, it says static, lacking in movement, action, or change, especially in an undesirable or uninteresting way. Sweet. I've definitely got you for the rest of the talk now. So it's a very loaded term. But my challenge to you is that when we say the word static, are we talking about a static experience for the user who's experiencing the site, or are we talking about a static hosting architecture? Because really one doesn't necessarily mean the other. And I'm talking about a static architecture, a way of deploying and serving sites that doesn't actually have to result in a feeling for the user, which is a static experience at all. I want to kind of demonstrate that static is a real virtue. It really unlocks a lot of capabilities, and that's what we want to get to. Before we get into that, let's talk about stacks. I've used the word stack a little bit, but what do we really mean by that? Well, when I'm talking about a stack, I'm talking about the layers of technology that deliver your website or your web application. That's what we're talking about. It's this delivery. Now, that doesn't mean that it's the tools that we use to build it in the first place, our kind of development process, the technologies we're bringing to bear to actually create the site that we then deliver from whatever our hosting stack is. But certainly the way we host things, the way we deploy them, has a huge impact on the way that we might be able to develop that. So I want to talk about that a little bit along the way. But let's do a little comparison. Let's just refresh our memory about what the LAMP stack consists of. We've got, Apache is the web server that's doing things like the HTTP routing and potentially like serving some of the static assets. We've got PHP in the stack, which is the pre-hypertext processor, which is doing the pre-processing and the logic at request time. We've got access to data through MySQL, and that sits on top of an operating system being Linux. Now that's all kind of wrapped conveniently up together in this notional web server of the LAMP stack. And that's what's serving our site. At scale, we'll typically have many of them that are kind of replicated to kind of share the load. So just as a kind of a refresher for us. Now, to compare that to the JAMstack, thinking about this JavaScript APIs and markup, what does that mean? Well, the key thing to remember here is that before, when we were talking about operating systems and things running on a server, at JAMstack, we've actually moved up a level. We're making the assumption that we're sitting on a static server or some kind of static infrastructure, potentially a CDN. And our area that we really care about is moved up. It's kind of closer to the browser now, because that's where our markup is being delivered. That's where our JavaScript is being delivered. And that is where we're kind of starting to make use of the runtime of the web. The browser and JavaScript have kind of become the runtime of the web. And that's where we're doing a lot of our work. So yes, we're delivering markup and JavaScript pre-rendered, pre-generated, so it can work in the browser. And then we might be calling on, our access to data might be through external APIs, or we might even think of APIs in, the A in JAMstack as calling browser APIs with JavaScript right there in the browser. So that's what this kind of comparison means. So JAMstack is pre-rendered, it's served statically, and it's progressively enhanced. It means that we can progressively enhance in the browser with JavaScript should we need to. Just again, doing this little side-by-side comparison of the LAMP stack and the JAMstack, once again, we've moved the stack up a level closer to the browser, closer to the user. Now, when we were building things with the LAMP stack, of course, that's not where it stopped. We were, of course, rendering HTML. We were outputting markup, and we were outputting JavaScript potentially, and maybe even calling APIs in the front end. So in some ways, the LAMP stack was all of this. With the JAMstack, we're kind of focusing down and narrowing things. And it's, again, this kind of simplify all kinds of things, including deployments and what have you, because we're trying to get away from this scary environment. Any opportunity we've got to simplify, of course, is something we should have. So if we do a little comparison, thinking about, where we're deploying code, here we might be, every deploy, we might need to get changes to our database servers, our web servers, logic on the load balancers, logic of the CDN, all of these things. With the JAMstack, we're deploying to one place. We're deploying to our static host or to our CDN. And this deployment process is the kind of thing that, our build runs either in a continuous integration service or it runs in our local development environment, and we push it to where we're serving the site from. And this decoupling is critical. This ability to change what's happening at request time versus what's happening in build time and separate the moving parts and the logic, that's really key to kind of simplifying. We've become very good at serving static assets on the web over the time. That's where we began. That's where we started before we started going crazy with Perl and CGI bins, the good old days. I'm kind of glancing across Andy Davies wherever he is. There he is. I know that you're a Perl guy, weren't you? Yeah, he loves the CGI bin. But we're getting really good at hosting kind of static assets now, and that's the key. When we can optimize getting our things to the CDN, that deployment process can become much, much simpler. There are loads of tools and services that can help with this. I work for one of them. I work for Netlify, but there are others to consider as well. The one at the top of the slide there is Surge, which has been around for a while as well, which lets you install via npm this kind of command line tool that when you run it, it will take your folder that you're in, your working directory, and pump the contents of that up to their static hosting infrastructure. The one at the bottom there, Zeit Now, have a similar kind of set of tooling, again, trying to make it easier to get things to a CDN, get things hosted statically. And of course, like some of the big players, the big cloud hosting providers like Azure, AWS, Google Cloud, they also are working on ways to make it easier and easier to get things up onto the cloud, get things hosted in an automated way. So there are lots of players here. All of them kind of behind the scenes are working on this notion of, you'll be running a build somewhere that might be a static site generator or something similar to that takes content, templates, data, the kind of things that were happening at the PHP level in the LAMP stack, and generating this kind of static set of resources that we can review locally, but also can get pushed to some hosting environment, ideally off to a CDN for an optimal experience. There are lots of different ways that we can run this deployment, and I'm not going to go into too many details of those today. I might touch on them a little bit. But before I do anything else, I actually want to address, whoa, that's bright. Whew. I want to address a common misconception. And I've set myself up for this, really, because this name JAMstack, and I said JAMstack is JavaScript, APIs, and markup. The issue is that it doesn't need to be JavaScript and APIs and markup. Every single one of these is kind of optional. You can use as much or as little of these as you like. The key really is in the fact that this is statically served. It's served without an origin server. So you could very easily have something that I would consider to be a JAMstack site that didn't include all of these things. Let's kind of explore that a tiny bit more. If the site was, again, it's small for people at the back, so apologies, but I'll read these out. So if this was a site that was perhaps generated with Jekyll, a static site generator that runs in the Ruby runtime, interpreting YAML files where the content is to deliver a site that maybe doesn't have any JavaScript at all, isn't making any requests to any APIs, and it's served on GitHub pages. Is that a JAMstack site? Yes, it absolutely is. What about using Gatsby, which is a static site generator that many of you might have encountered, which is JavaScript-based, running in the React ecosystem? Maybe this is taking content from Markdown files. Maybe it's querying content from GraphQL APIs. It's doing hydration using JavaScript in the front end in the browser as well. It's served from Amazon S3, perhaps. That's a JAMstack site as well. We move along, Hugo, a static site generator built on Go. Again, maybe using Markdown for its content, adding some JavaScript interactions, but not calling any other APIs, serving it on Google Cloud. That's JAMstack. Nuxt, if you're more of a view person, a static site generator, taking things like JSON files, adding JavaScript interactions, maybe calling commerce APIs to do e-commerce, served on something like Netlify, perhaps. Absolutely a JAMstack site. And then this last example, maybe you're an artisan and you're kind of going to hand roll your own JavaScript with no frameworks and build a progressive web app, compile it all together using Webpack, maybe using something like JSON Web Tokens for authentication to some API service somewhere, using browser APIs for goodness knows what, servicing on Azure. Yeah, that's JAMstack as well. The whole point is that it's a really broad ecosystem. Lots of things could be considered JAMstack, but all of these things share one thing in common, which you definitely can't see. And that is that none of them have an origin server. That's the thing that they share in common, and that's the thing that I think makes these things JAMstack. Because remember, JAMstack means they're capable of being served directly from a CDN. Okay, so what are the kind of impacts and implications of this now that we've defined it a little bit? Well, let's start with security. Security is something that's top of mind when we're delivering things out to the web. And with a JAMstack, we've got a greatly reduced surface area for attack. We'll go back to this kind of friendly diagram once again and think about places where we might experience some kind of an attack. We have to think about how we secure the load balancer. We have to think about how we secure the web server and the database and make sure that those things aren't susceptible to any kind of attack. Indeed, the CDN, we have to think about that as well. Now, the more static that CDN is, the more static the assets are, and the less logic that's executed there, the fewer things that can actually be done to that. I mean, maybe we might experience some kind of denial of service attack by trying to flood it with requests, but that's more of a scaling issue than a security issue. So by reducing, the number of pieces of infrastructure that are serving in a request, we end up with far fewer moving parts that can be attacked. At Netlify, we run our own CDN, and as a result, we get the luxury of being able to see what kind of traffic is passing across it, what requests are coming in, and overwhelmingly, we have this huge amount of traffic, a huge proportion of traffic, which is making a request to all of the domains that live on Netlify and looking for WP admin, the admin console for WordPress. There is no such thing anywhere on Netlify because we won't run WordPress because it's a static hosting infrastructure, so it's not on the JAMstack. I love the fact that there are one or two people who redirect WP admin of their sites to YouTube and to rickrolling people. But I'm not sure that all of these attacks are actually coming from someone like typing in the domain and visiting and looking in their browser. And go, I think it's a little bit more automated than that. But I like the notion nonetheless. But it's this decoupling that's key here. What's happening at runtime versus at request time versus build time is quite different. There are no moving parts in this environment to be attacked. All the moving parts are decoupled, and they happen way before time, at deployment time and at build time, rather than at request time. This, as you might imagine, has an implication for performance as well. Now, let's go back to our faithful diagram here. Just by simple virtue of the distance that the request has to travel and the systems it has to interact with, it is faster by default. We'll often find that traditional stacks will start to introduce effectively static layers into the stack to try and speed things up. I'm talking about caching. We think about where we might try and optimize things for performance here. We're likely to put some caching into our web servers and potentially cache common queries to our database servers throughout the stack, even at the load balancing level, and the CDN itself is a giant cache. The bottom of the diagram, everything is in a cache. Everything is served from this content delivery network, and everything is effectively cached there at deploy time. The level at the top, we're adding these layers that actually start to move us closer to things behaving as a static site, but we still have to maintain the logic of what gets served statically, what's dynamic, how do we control the logic of that. So we're set up for performance in a much better way on this simplified stack. This kind of touches on scale as well. And when I'm talking about scale, I'm talking about trying to handle large levels of loads. Traditional stacks will typically add infrastructure to the equation in order to scale out. Yes, our caching layers that we put in will help us for sure. But ultimately, when we're trying to figure out how do we service millions of requests, what typically happens is we'll start adding more machines to our stack of web servers, to our database servers, potentially to our load balancers. We'll have more load balancers as well. So there's lots of complexity that kind of creeps in. And as someone who's kind of worked in technical architecture and planning and scoping and costing these kind of things, and being asked, how many servers do you need for your website? Well, how much traffic we need to get? It's challenging. It's really difficult. So if we can simplify this, I'm all for that. This touches as well on developer experience, and I'm cautious about using the phrase developer experience because sometimes we kind of get tempted into this feeling that developer experience is the be-all and end-all, and it trumps user experience. And that's not what I think. I think that a good developer experience unlocks the capability of creating a great user experience. It gets cruft and friction out of the way so that we can focus on the nuance and the subtlety of building something that's great. In this environment, again, where the work we're doing is kind of down in this section at the bottom where the build is happening, we're taking as read that serving it is a solved problem because static hosting is something we've become very good at on the internet. So really, we're focusing down here, where our build is. And this is a really well-defined problem space for us. And critically, we've got freedom to make some decisions here. We're not coupled to the hosting architecture and the cogs and pieces of machinery that have to turn there. I love the fact that this introduces freedom and it introduces choices. It gives us the freedom, from the technical constraints of sometimes potentially pretty exotic platforms, content management systems, hosting infrastructure. They can often, take you down a particular route for building and serving sites. And it gives you the choice of the kind of tools and approaches that you want and that best fit your team and best fit the kind of project you're building. It's not forcing your hand. You can choose what you like. But the other thing it gives you is this confidence. The fact that you don't have to deploy to all of these different moving parts at the same time means that you can deploy with real confidence. And I'm going to show you a little example of that in just a second and what that's talking about. But I think that a JAMstack site can far more easily have immutable and atomic deploys. And that sounds a bit buzzwordy. So what are we talking about? Well, when I'm talking about an atomic deploy, I mean that the site, the deployment itself is only valid when all of it is there self-contained together. You're not in a situation where you've got a partial deployment. If you think about those lines and boxes we had with databases and load balancers and web servers, we've got to make changes on all of those things. And those changes arrive at different times, potentially. So you can get yourself into a position where not everything changes at exactly the same time. An immutable deployment is, again, it's kind of related. And this is unlocked by virtue of the fact that we're serving static assets. An immutable deploy, by its very definition, is not mutating the state of the server. We're not making incremental changes on a server. What we're doing is we're taking this whole atomic change and we're saying, here it is, this is a new state of the site, and that can live on in perpetuity. And it means that we can do things like roll back from one version to another, and all of these things get unlocked purely because we're hosting something effectively statically. So I'm going to do something which is either brave or silly. I'm going to go and look at my own website. No, am I? Let's see. Here we are. No, you can't see that. Hang on. I decided to unmirror, and the notification is need more displays. Never has that been more true. All right, well let's try this. This will be easy. Okay. All right. Okay. All right. Let's see if I can do this. Oh dear, this is excruciating, but it will be fine. Okay, so what I'm doing is I am looking at, so forgive me, I'm going to show you something in Netlify to make the point. It's because of what I know best. This is where I work, but the principle is something that is unlocked by virtue of this being statically hosted from a CDN. I'm going to look at deploys. So I'm looking here at the list of all of the deployments that have happened on my site. Now, each of these sections is a deploy, and I mentioned this kind of notion of immutability, the fact that these deploys can live on forever, and each one of these, in fact, has its own URL. Let me tell you what. I'll show you what it looks like now. So this is my site. It's just a blog. It's not getting the traffic I think it deserves. Is what I'm saying. But critically, here, where's my, have I got a mouse? There it is. So each of these deployments is something that's happened in the past. I did one today at 1:45 that happened automatically because I tweeted, and every time I tweet, it does a deploy, it pulls in my tweets, it puts them on the page. But I can do things like, I could go back as far in time as I dare to the very beginning. I can look at the site. This is what it looked like back in 2016, and surprise, surprise, I was banging on about the JAMstack then as well. So this is what the site. Oops. This is what the site kind of looks like then. And there's my mouse. There it is. And it has this URL that you might just have to say my word for it. It's, so it has this unique URL, which is unique for that deployment. Oh, I've really messed with the monitor when I did the zoom. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I promise not to do that again. But if I wanted to, what I could do is I could find my mouse. Oh dear. Anyone see a mouse on there? I know it's around. It's there. Thanks. Honestly, I don't know what I expected you to do. So if I go to this deployment itself, I could see the deploy logs that happened when it built. And if I wanted, I could say, publish that deploy. So now, since this is a static site, which is already hosted on the CDN, if I go back to my, come on, my actual site, and if I kind of refresh that, now I've published that to the world. So if you were to go to my site, I'm sure you're on there already, bless you, that it would now have stepped back in time to 2016. And that's because we're hosting things statically. I'm going to put it back, I think, to I'll kill that. This might take me a moment because I can't see what I'm doing. Deploys. Today, okay, so I'll go back here. Say publish that deploy. Publish. Oops. Hopefully now. Okay, so we're back to normal. This is kind of the advantage of having immutable deploys that live on in perpetuity. There's not lots of moving parts. The work was done ahead of time. So now we're simply kind of flicking versions around from one to the next. But you might say, well, that's a simple. Oh, come on, where are you? At the top. Is this fun for you? Is everyone doing okay? My discomfort is fun, thank you. Oh, there it is. There it is. There it is. I'm almost there. I won't be dabbling here for too much longer because that would be insanity. But yeah, it doesn't. It's not picking it up for some. It's the same deal. Yeah, I'm doing the jiggle. I'm doing the mouse jiggle as well. But so what I just showed you was kind of simple, right? It was just a blog, it was pre-rendered. But what if you were building an application that was calling lots of APIs and it was more like a web app than a website? Well, this that I'm looking at, this is a website, a web app. It's a React web app. So if I was to go into the site for the admin for this itself, God, this is dangerous, especially since I can't actually see what the hell I'm doing. So Netlify is built and served on Netlify. So this UI is a JAMstack site that's served as a React app from our own hosting infrastructure. So I could, in the same way, if I go to deploys, or this is the potential for a screw up is massive. Here. Tell you what, I'm not going to keep just paging through them all because I don't want to give away secrets. There's more than 800 pages of deploys on here. As you imagine, we've been deploying for a while. But we could do something like, let's go and look at the production version of this from February 2017 and open that up. And this is what come on, there we are. This is what the web app looked back in 2017. I'm just going to log in, hopefully. Oh, this might just be a bridge too far for me to demonstrate over my shoulder. It's probably just as well because I don't want you to see me accidentally deploy a 2-year-old version of the site. A couple of things would happen. It would be impressive, and I'd be fired. Okay, I'm going to try and come back to safety here. That was a voyage of discovery, wasn't it? Okay, so what? I'm asking myself that. How never has that been more opportune? But Netlify is a Netlify site hosted on Netlify, but ultimately it's a JAMstack site. It's a bunch of static assets served from a CDN that's talking to a bunch of APIs. Let's mention APIs and services for a moment or two. There's a bunch of different things that this unlocks if you have an API kind of based model for your sites and applications. You can access bought services. So those might be things that you're accessing either through the browser at runtime or potentially at build time in your build. So we might be doing things like pulling content from content management systems. There's a number of them that exist. Where we might be pulling the data from those into our build, generating the site and outputting it, or we might be doing it in the browser. We might be, look at that. We might be serving assets from something like Cloudinary or some API that lives on the web that can serve our assets for us and do transformations. We might be doing things like commerce, and there's a bunch of different vendors that can do e-commerce for us now, again, as a progressive enhancement in the browser through JavaScript. And even things like identity, using things like Auth0 or OAuth. All of these things expose APIs that we can then consume. And so we don't have to build all of these things internally and become experts in all of these things. The kind of team you need to be an expert in everything here is kind of large. But in addition to bought services, there's also the fact that this model unlocks a much simpler way to build your own services. You might be thinking I'm advocating for just only building static sites and just that static HTML. But actually, this model is great if you also have APIs that you build yourself. I kind of almost got to show you that with Netlify ourselves, where we've got a static site and a bunch of APIs that drive it. So in this way, we can start to add to these other services our own core capabilities. We might be building those things out as APIs ourselves that live in a different stack that have just a very focused set of jobs and roles. Occasionally, you absolutely need some kind of logic that runs on a server. And that's where things like serverless functions can come to the rescue. I'm cautious about saying the word serverless because people will say, I think you'll find there's a server running there somewhere, Phil. And to which I answer, well, your wireless router at home. So I don't know if my microphone's still good. I thought I'd been cut off. I thought it's which would be fair. So when I'm talking about serverless, I'm talking about functions as a service. And I'm not going to go into that now because I just don't have the time. But they're a fantastic companion to the JAMstack. They're this great way of creating very focused services that can embellish things that you can call via APIs. So I've just got a couple of minutes left. So let's just show a couple of kind of quick examples and results. Sites like this, like React.js, it's a JAMstack site hosted statically, as is Yarn and Vue. Those all kind of feel kind of similar in terms of, yes, they're very large load and large audiences, but they're kind of simple, kind of static kind of sites. This is a great one. It's a documentation site from Citrix, which is a multilingual site that they've gradually moved away from this huge technology stack, finding one area of their site that would fit this model perfectly and sending that traffic to being on static servers. They did a great talk at the JAMstack conference in New York that happened a few weeks ago, where Beth Pollock, who's part of the team at Citrix, talked about the turnaround time for updates went from weeks to minutes. And she's talking about not just code, but also content, because some of these big systems can have really slow turnaround times for updates. So that was a great result for them. In fact, they said it kind of reduced the cost by about 65% building this way. So the results are really impressive. A slightly different kind of site to those that we've just seen before, one that might be a bit surprising, is the Smashing Magazine. Is a JAMstack site. It's hosted statically. And this isn't just articles and things that were posted once upon a time on WordPress, but now static. There's other things here. There's a membership area that has login. There's e-commerce. There's a job board. All kinds of things. At one point, it was on 5 different platforms running, and now it's on one because it's statically generated and then hosted on a CDN. Vitaly Friedman, who is involved in the project here, talked about having lots of caching issues with the site, and so we probably had every WordPress caching plugin there is out there. And then, by going JAMstack, they changed their time to first load from 800 milliseconds down to 80. So it's a 10x improvement in performance. I'm going to skip to the end because I'm kind of out of time. But I wanted to kind of just describe that we can serve a variety of sites in this way. I asked about what is the JAMstack at the beginning, and I'd say that JAMstack sites are rendered in advance. They're not dependent on an origin server. That's the kind of thing that's key. They can be progressively enhanced in the browser with JavaScript, but you don't have to use JavaScript, remember. Those are kind of the core attributes of JAMstack sites. It's this modern architecture for fast and secure sites without web servers. This talk has got, these slides have got a bunch of different links and resources should you wish to have them. I will tweet, sorry, I was very quick, people taking pictures. What I'll do is I will tweet during the rest of the day using the Pixel Pioneers hashtag, the link to these slides so you can get these and kind of peruse them at your leisure. Thank you for bearing with me with the over-the-shoulder demo. Thanks for your attention. Thanks a lot.